Hello, I'm Matthew Jowern, I'm the University of Dundee Museum Curator, and welcome to my historical campus tour. We're going to be having a little wander around the campus, looking at some of the early buildings, and as we go around I'll tell you a little bit about the history of the university and about some of the key people that taught here. So I just want to start with some basic facts and figures. The university was originally founded as University College Dundee in 1881. And we first opened to students in 1883. Now initially we didn't have full university status, so that meant that although students could come here to study, they actually had to go elsewhere to sit their exams and take their degrees. And originally that was done down in London, but then in 1890 an agreement was reached with the University of St Andrews, which ultimately led, after various complexities, to us becoming in 1897 a college of the University of St Andrews. We were renamed Queen's College Dundee in 1954, still part of St Andrews, and we finally became the independent University of Dundee in 1967. So we're starting our tour here outside the Students' Union, and for students this is very much the heart of the campus, but we're actually quite some distance away from where the university actually began in the 1880s. If you'd stood here in 1881, you would have seen a very different picture. This whole area, we're just really coming into what's known as the Blackness area of Dundee, was one of the densest concentration of jute and other textile mills. And so all of this would once have been huge big jute mills. And indeed where Belmont Hall of Residence now is, Belmont Flats, as you can see here, was once called Belmont Mill. And the university really started because one of the families that ran these big textile mills, the Baxter family, who owned Dens Works, they really felt that they needed to do something to help improve the educational prospects of their workers and indeed of the many other working class people in Dundee. The city had grown hugely during the 19th century as a result of the great expansion, first of the linen industry and then particularly of the jute industry. And so the population tripled within just a few decades. That brought with it a lot of social problems. Obviously, workers were paid absolute pittance, they lived in appalling accommodation, they had very little educational prospects. And so the idea of the Baxter family was to help actually try to improve people's educational prospects and thus help them kind of work their way out of poverty. So right from the start, the university really was an integral part of the city, and it was very much about trying to benefit the lives of people in Dundee, and that's very much still an important ethos that we have today. So let's begin our tour, and we're going to head off this way. So just coming around past the university chaplaincy that you can see here. The chaplaincy was one of the various new buildings to be built after we gained our independent status. The campus expanded quite significantly. And we're coming on to Cross Row here, and we have the library on the right, but on the left here we have this wonderful old row of tenement houses. And this is really the one surviving block of its kind in this area. So a large part of this area would have been tenements like this that housed the people that worked in the mills that we would have seen where the halls of residence are. And so there were rows and rows of these, and almost every single one of them has now been demolished. This is the one survivor. How much longer that's the case, I'm not entirely sure. The university has for some years been talking about demolishing these, and ultimately they hope to put a new School of Business building on that site. But who knows how long that will take. So enjoy the buildings while you can. Okay, so let's carry on down onto Small's Wynd here. On the left you'll see the Fulton Building, which opened in 1964. That was built for civil and mechanical engineering. And on the right here we're just coming up to the back of the Ewing Building. The Ewing Building was the first post-war building on the university campus, opened in 1954. And so it's kind of, architecturally it's quite interesting because it combines that kind of austere elegance of post-war building with still little hints of Art Deco design from the pre-war period. And it originally was built to house electrical engineering, and it was named in honour of James Alford Ewing, who was a very significant figure, who was actually the first professor of engineering at University College Dundee. Ewing was originally born in Dundee, went to the high school, and before coming back to the university as Professor of Engineering, he had actually been in Tokyo working as a Professor of Mechanical Engineering and Physics at the university there. And while there, he actually became one of the key inventors of the seismograph for measuring earthquakes. After his time in Dundee, he went down to teach in Cambridge, and then during the First World War, he headed up the Admiralty's code-breaking team, the famous Room 40, which was responsible, among other things, for cracking the Zimmerman telegraph, which famously was one of the key things that helped to bring the United States of America into the war. And within his own field, he's really best known as the discoverer of hysteresis, which is the property of magnetic materials that allows them to have a memory, which is therefore the basis of, for example, computer hard disks and credit cards and all sorts of different things that we take for granted today. Okay, so we're just walking down Small's Wynd now. And some lovely gardens on the left here in front of the Franklin Building, which is one of the 60s buildings that was built originally for chemistry, but now used by the dental school. The buildings on the right were actually old jute sheds that have been incorporated into the physics and engineering buildings. And this is the old medical school. We'll come back to visit that in more detail later on. I'm just going to speed up a little bit here just to get us to our next destination. We're now coming past the Old Technical Institute again. We'll come back to that later on. So we're just heading round to the front of the tower building, but we're actually going to first of all walk underneath the tower extension. The tower was opened in 1961, but the extension was added on a few years later in 1968. Just coming down onto the main road on Nethergate. And just coming up to the front of the tower building now. So where the tower now is the site of 4 original houses that were purchased by University College when it first started to form its initial accommodation. So they were all late 18th century buildings, 4 individual houses that were then adapted to be joined together and expanded to become the main accommodation for most of the subjects in the university. And among other things, it was in the easternmost of these 4 buildings that the Natural History Department was based, and this is where one of the most important members of staff at the university, Darcy Thompson, was based. Now, Darcy Thompson was the first professor of biology at the university, so really the starting point for the massive life sciences empire that we now have. And he built up a huge and impressive zoology museum in this building. It was actually one of the largest natural history museums of its kind anywhere in the UK. Unfortunately, these buildings were demolished in the late 50s to make way for the tower, including Darcy's original museum, and a lot of the collection was lost or sent elsewhere at that time. But we still have the core of that original collection, and it's now housed in the current Darcy Thompson Zoology Museum over in the Carnegie Building. But Darcy Thompson really became more famous for his work on mathematical biology. He was really the first person to look at trying to explain the way that organisms grow and the different forms that they take using fundamental laws of physics and mathematics. And he wrote a book about this called On Growth and Form, which is really the founding text of biomathematics. And it's had a huge influence, not just in biology, but also in many, many other fields, particularly in art, design and architecture. Some of the most famous artists and architects of the last 100 years, from Henry Moore, Salvador Dali, Jackson Pollock, to Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Norman Foster and many, many others, were all reading and were hugely inspired by On Growth and Form. So it had always been the intention of the university to knock down these 4 original houses and build something more impressive. But as part of the University of St Andrews, we were kind of somewhat tied in what we were able to do. St Andrews was always rather unwilling to spend any money on this side of the Tay. Now, over the years, the relationships between the two organisations gradually got worse, and eventually in 1951 a Royal Commission was set up to look at the issue of university education, and specifically the problem of this relationship between Dundee and St Andrews. And one of the things that concluded was that University College was dissolved and reformed in 1954 as Queen's College Dundee, still as part of the University of St Andrews, but with greater administrative freedom. And we were very fortunate in that the principal at the University of St Andrews in the 1950s was Thomas Malcolm Knox. And Knox really believed in the importance of Dundee. Unlike many of his predecessors, he was really determined to see the university succeed in Dundee. And as you'll see here, it was Knox that laid the foundation stone of the Tower Building in 1959. And so the Tower really was built as a symbol of the importance of Dundee, the importance of having a university presence in the city. And so it kind of symbolised the strength, the importance and the modernity of this university. And Knox ultimately really became the driving force behind Dundee becoming an independent university in *67. So the Tower Building is really quite unusual. It was the very first tower building in Dundee, although many more would follow. But what's very unusual is that unlike most buildings of this size, which are built of concrete, it's made of traditional stone and wood. So really, really unusual, and it was designed by Sir Robert Matthew, a very notable architect, and in fact it's now a listed building. Now, we're going to head inside the tower building, and we're going to go out the back door, and there are various things in the tower, but most notable, from my point of view anyway, is this is where we have our main exhibition spaces for the University Museum collections. So we have two galleries in the tower foyer, and upstairs in the Lamb Gallery on the first floor. And the exhibitions change over every few months. There's always something different to see, and we do art exhibitions, we show scientific instruments and natural history specimens and all sorts of different things from the University Museum collections. And the exhibitions are all free and open to the public, so do come along and check them out when you're able. Okay, so we're now coming out the back door of the tower. And we're just going to head up this way. So on the left here you'll see College Hall, which was as the name suggests, was the original kind of hall in which all the students gathered in the early days of University College. Of course, in those days there were only a couple of hundred students, so you could actually fit them all in one building with, over 18,000 students. We couldn't really do that now. And this very large and impressive building that you'll see ahead of us here is the original School of Medicine. Now, medicine was one of the key subjects that Dundee wanted to teach right from the start. And it was really the possibility of awarding medical degrees that first led us to establish links with the University of St Andrews. St Andrews had been awarding medical degrees for centuries, but they were largely just a paper exercise. They didn't have the kind of facilities to teach proper practical classes. But of course, we did. We had proper hospitals and so on. So, in 1890, a conjoint medical school was established between the two institutions. The idea was that students would do their preclinical work in St Andrews and they would come and do their practical classes at Dundee Royal Infirmary here in the city. But right from the start, Dundee really wanted to have its own fully equipped medical school. So rather sneakily, just before the conjoint medical school was established, Dundee established its own chairs of anatomy and physiology in order to be able to teach the preclinical subjects ourselves. But one of the problems was we didn't really have proper accommodation to teach medical students. And so when in 1897 University College Dundee officially became part of the University of St Andrews, St Andrews was not in any way willing to start spending money on medical facilities in Dundee. And indeed, the rector at St Andrews, the Marquess of Bute, who had a particular hatred of Dundee, specifically funded the Bute Medical School in St Andrews in 1897, which opened in 1899. And so Dundee had to wait until 1902 when we had a different rector by that point, Andrew Carnegie, the millionaire businessman, and he helped to fund the building of a proper medical school in Dundee. Begun in 1902 with, as you can see, St Andrews University carved in a wonderful sort of colonial stamp of authority on the outside of the building here. The building opened in 1904 and really allowed a massive expansion of medical teaching in Dundee. And so, although there was still preclinical teaching offered in St Andrews, you could do your entire medical degree in Dundee, albeit getting awarded from St Andrews. It's worth saying that the first proper dean of the medical school, Edward Weymouth Reid, was one of the great characters of the university. He was the professor of physiology here and was quite an eccentric. He apparently hated Dundee, hated most of his fellow staff. He had a little model gallows, and anyone he didn't like, he would hang them in effigy on these gallows. But he was very popular with students, particularly because when they were trying to raise money for special events, for example, trying to raise money for student playing fields, he would turn his laboratory into a sweet factory and then sell all of the various sweets that they produced. He had this wonderful kind of fictional alter ego called Herr Dr. Bimstein von Pompdeluder, who produced all these sweets and wrote little pamphlets about the science of confectionery. They're absolutely hilarious. Okay, we're now going to head to this building beside the old medical school. The two are actually now joined by a little link entrance here. But this is the Carnegie Building, and this is the first building to be purpose-built for the new university campus. So just behind that row of original houses that I told you about before. And so this was the chemistry laboratory. Initially just 2 stories high, the later 2 stories were added in the 1950s. And it was built by local architects, Island and McLaren, but with a lot of input from the first professor of chemistry, Thomas Carnegie, after whom it was later named. But one of the really interesting features that he introduced into the building was a pioneering form of air conditioning. Carnegie did a lot of work on air quality in slum housing. He was one of the founders of a very important and influential group called the Dundee Social Union, along with various other early professors at the university, which really tried to help improve the lives of a lot of the poorest people in Dundee. And so one of his contributions was to actually visit various slum houses and measure the air quality and investigate the various bacteria and see how that actually affected the health of the people that lived in it. And so one of his solutions to this problem was air conditioning. And so he invented this kind of system of ducts. All the air coming into the building was filtered, warmed, humidified, and there were fans to kind of drive out the various noxious fumes that were created in the chemistry labs and expel them from the building. The system didn't work quite as well as he'd hoped. Various punctures in the ducts meant that very often the various poisonous fumes were just moved around from one room to another, which wasn't really the idea. But Carnegie really believed in the system, and he wrote very widely on how it could be used in schools and other public buildings. So it's kind of interesting that air conditioning is something we take for granted in a lot of modern buildings today, but this was really quite pioneering at the time. While we're at the front of the building here, it's worth just pointing out the 2 crests that you'll see on the front. So the one on the right is the original University College Dundee crest, and then over on the left we have the University of St Andrews crest. Okay, so we're now coming up to another really grand and impressive building. This is one that started not as part of the university but as a separate institution, the Dundee Training College. So the Training College was basically the teacher training facility in Dundee. In 1905 there was a nationwide movement in Scotland to establish formal training colleges for teachers throughout the country. And all of them were centred around, but not actually directly connected to, the 4 ancient universities of Scotland. So Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen and St Andrews. But obviously it made more sense for the St Andrews one to be in Dundee, where there was a far greater population and far greater need for the training of teachers. So the so-called St Andrews Provincial Committee established Dundee Training College, which opened in 1906, initially with no accommodation of its own. They actually used part of the Technical Institute, which we'll come on to look at later on. And it was only in 1912 that they finally started work on this building, specifically for the training college. And so here we have different crests on the front of the building because the four provincial committees were administered through the town and city councils. The crests that we have here are on the right, the Dundee City crest, and on the left, the St Andrews town crest. And these wreaths were added at the front of the building to mark the fact that during the First World War, although the building hadn't actually been completed, it was requisitioned and used as a Red Cross hospital. And so these wreaths were added at the front of the building to mark the end of the Great War and its use as a war hospital. It was finally completed in 1920 and occupied at that point by Dundee Training College. And so it was later renamed Dundee College of Education, and they remained there right up until 1975 when they moved out to a new purpose-built, a much larger campus on Gardine Road out near Broughty Ferry. And that then became the main teacher training college out there right up until 2001 when they became affiliated to the University of Dundee. And ultimately came back onto the campus as what's today our School of Education and Social Work. Meanwhile, this building was taken over by the university to house the law and psychology departments, both of which are still in the building today, along with various other parts of School of Social Sciences. And it was named the Scrimgeour Building in honour of Henry Scrimgeour, who was a 16th century lawyer from Dundee, and his family once owned all of the land around here. Okay, we're now going to head back around the front of the tower. I'll just speed up a bit again. It's worth mentioning that a lot of the houses on the opposite side of Nethergate here were once owned by the university and used for various different departments, but sadly one by one they were all sold off. Well, we're now coming up to two of the oldest buildings on the campus. We have two old villas here, Ellen Bank and Union Mount. Both of them either late 18th or early 19th century buildings, which would have been private houses for many years. And they were bought by the university in 1904 and were later adapted and joined together with this section in the middle here in the 1920s. And Ellen Bank was adapted to become the Students' Union, and Union Mount became the University College Library. And if you look above the door here, you might just be able to make out the word library still written there. It's kind of quite difficult to see in this light. And in creating the Student Union, they further adapted Ellen Bank to add a separate entrance around at the side because they wanted to keep male and female students apart. Now, it's worth pointing out at this point that, very unusually, University College Dundee was founded by a woman, Mary Ann Baxter, and one of the founding principles that she made was that the university would offer education equally to students of both sexes. Now, that was absolutely pioneering. That had not happened in any institution in the UK prior to that point. So, in many ways, they were very forward-thinking, but obviously such enlightenment only went so far when it came to the actual practicalities of having men and women together in the same building. Okay, now this building ahead of us here is another one that was founded not as part of the university but as a separate building. This is the original home of the Dundee Technical Institute. It was founded in 1888 and funded by Sir David Baxter, who was actually Mary Ann Baxter's brother. Now, David Baxter had died in 1872, and in his will he'd left a sum of money to found a Mechanics Institute in Dundee. Now, unfortunately, the amount of money he left wasn't quite enough to actually allow his trustees to do that. And so it was only when University College was founded in the 1880s that the trustees realised that if they built their building next to University College, they could share a lot of facilities and indeed some of the staff, and thus make the Technical Institute a viable proposition. So that's what they did. It was built here on Smalls Wynd, right next to the university campus, and many of the university staff also taught evening classes at the Technical Institute. It opened in 1888, and you can see these rather lovely carved frieze on the front here showing some of the different trades that were taught in the Institute. And very quickly it became hugely popular, and within just a few years it was absolutely overflowing. And so a fundraising campaign was begun in 1907, which ultimately led in 1910 to a new college opening in Bell Street in the centre of town, which was renamed Dundee Technical College and School of Art, because one of the most popular subjects that was taught there was art and design. And that part of the technical college is what ultimately became Duncan of Jordanstone College of Art and Design, which we'll come on to look at in a moment. And the rest of the technical college, which stayed on Bell Street, is what's now Abertay University, Dundee's other university. Okay, the building that we're coming up to on the left here is the Fleming Gymnasium, which was the original sports centre, the equivalent of the Institute of Sport and Exercise today. And it was endowed by Robert Fleming, a very notable banker who was born in Lochee in Dundee and made a huge amount of money in America, founded Fleming's Investment Bank. And one of the notable stories about Robert Fleming is that while he was in America, he got involved in all sorts of interesting adventures, including kind of industrial espionage stories, which he later passed on to his grandson, who was Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. So we're now coming up into the Geddes Quadrangle. This is, I think, probably the most beautiful part of the campus. Really gorgeous buildings here, lovely gardens laid out. So when the university started, obviously chemistry had its own building, what became the Carnegie Building. But the other science subjects were really cramped for accommodation in these original houses. And even with the acquisition of the Technical Institute building, they really needed more space for properly equipped scientific laboratories. And in 1909, thanks again to funding from the millionaire businessman Andrew Carnegie, our former rector, a new physics laboratory was built here, which was actually named the Carnegie Building in honour of its funder. And this was undoubtedly the most impressive building to be built on the university campus thus far. Rather than going to a local architect, they went to Scotland's leading architect of the day, Sir Rowan Anderson, to design the building, although in fact Anderson passed over much of the work to his assistant, Balfour Paul. And as with Thomas Carnelly and the design of the Carnegie Building, a lot of the design of the physics laboratory was actually influenced very much by the professor of physics at the time, J.P. Coonan. So, for example, he insisted that no iron be used in the construction of the building because that would interfere with a lot of the magnetic experiments that were going on in them. One of the key early students who would have studied in this building was a young chap called Robert Alexander Watson Watt. He originally came to study engineering and then did a postgraduate course in radio waves. And he later famously became known as the pioneer of radar. And indeed, during the Second World War, he actually helped to establish a top-secret radar research station in the Scrimgeour building on the university campus. So the Carnegie Building opened in 1909 and was soon followed by the adjacent Peters Building for electrical engineering. You can't see it here, but we'll go past it in a moment. And then this building on the right here, what's now called the Harris Building for engineering. Now, in fact, physics have since moved out of the Carnegie Building and moved into the Harris Building, so they're now based in that building. And the Harris Building was built by local architect James Finlay, but obviously very much fitting in with the design of the other two buildings, but with its own distinctive features, including this very grand tower here. So the last building was erected in 1912, and then the sundial was erected in 1914, designed by Coonan's successor as Professor of Physics, William Peddy. And it was really erected to mark a visit that had taken place to the university 2 years earlier by the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which was quite a significant event which the university had really helped to organise. Now, meanwhile, the garden areas were being laid out by Patrick Geddes, after whom the Geddes quadrangle is now named. And Geddes is another of the really crucial figures in the early history of the university. Geddes was the professor of botany. He came in 1888, but he had really far-reaching ideas and interests far beyond botany. And rather than looking at individual plants in detail, he began to think on a much broader scale. And he started looking at humans and our societies and our towns and cities and viewing them as biological systems and really studying them from an evolutionary point of view as kind of organically evolving. And as a result, Geddes came to be viewed as the father of modern town planning. And he undertook major surveys of cities all around the world, particularly in India, in Jerusalem. He was one of the key people involved in planning the modern city of Tel Aviv. So he had huge interests all over the world. But at the same time, for over 30 years, he was professor of botany here at the university, and of course you can imagine how extraordinary his lectures were, because he would begin talking about a single plant, and by the end of his lecture he would have brought in fine art and sociology and political economy. I mean, all sorts of amazing things. So Geddes laid out the gardens here specifically in sort of evolutionary pattern. So each bed was planted with a different group, showing the kind of systematic evolution of that group. And the story goes that he initially laid out the paths here in the shape of a swastika, which of course before it was appropriated by the Nazis was an ancient symbol of natural goodness and well-being. But for obvious reasons they decided to change that. Okay, so here you can see the Peters Electrical Engineering Laboratory that I mentioned earlier. And we'll just head round the back of the building. Again, there's more really nice gardens around the back here as well. We do have a wonderfully green campus, I'm glad to say. So this is the University Library on the right here, but we're going to head round to the left. And we're just at the back of the Student Union here. We're just going to squeeze in behind this little outdoor cafe area. Trying to avoid this guy watering the plants. Okay, and we're just coming out now at the top of Airlie Place. So the buildings here were all originally built as private residences, but the university now owns the whole of this street. It took them quite a while to accomplish that. They started buying the bottom end of the street in 1917 and only finally completed buying the last house on the street in 1971. Now, 2 years before that, a fairly major change had occurred with the building of this distinctive edifice, the Student Union. Prior to that, the street actually ended in a separate Victorian terraced row of houses here called Airlie Terrace. And there's a little square here with a nice green. And that was deliberately built to create a cul-de-sac to prevent anyone getting through onto Hawkhill on the other side of the street. And that was very much a status thing, because these were quite high status tenements, very much built for the kind of aspiring upper middle classes of Dundee. But on the other side in Hawkhill was, as I mentioned at the beginning, very densely populated industrial area with these kind of working class tenement houses and lots of horrible fuming chimneys from all the mills. So a lot of the streets that come off Perth Road here deliberately end in cul-de-sacs to try and sort of block off all of that industrial stuff behind. And so, as I say, these were quite high status houses, built from the 1850s up to the 1870s. They would have their own bathrooms, they would have all the sort of latest mod cons. A lot of them have quite fancy balconies outside the buildings. So really kind of high status. And so some quite significant figures lived here over the years. Indeed, at one point the street was actually known as Dundee's Harley Street because a lot of very notable doctors and surgeons lived here. There were also newspaper editors and shipping company owners. Another notable resident was Joseph Lee, who was a local journalist and artist who became particularly well known during the First World War as a war poet. He became one of Scotland's best known war poets. Somewhat ironically, although perhaps inevitably, the more the university bought of the street, the more its social status plummeted. And during the Second World War, the fancy green that was built was dug up to plant potatoes and so on, and later just became a rough patch of grass, and then eventually was turned into the car park. Today, the School of Health Sciences, which started as Dundee College of Nursing, is now on the east side of the street, and various administrative departments are on the west side. Right, we're now heading on to Perth Road, back onto the main road here. And yeah, another of the old University College Dundee crests there. The university also owns this nice old villa. It's now where the Research and Innovation Services are based. And what we're coming up to now are the two buildings that form Duncan of Jordanson College of Art and Design. So I mentioned before that the Art College started life as a very small part of the Technical Institute. When it moved to Bell Street, that was renamed Dundee Technical College and School of Art because the art and design subjects had become so popular. And just at the same time that they were in the process of moving to Bell Street, somewhat out of the blue, in 1909, a wealthy businessman called James Duncan of Jordanson died and left the bulk of his estate to found an independent art school in Dundee. Now, of course, there was already an art school in the Technical Institute, and so naturally the trustees there said, well, clearly we should have that money. But in his will, Duncan had specified that his art school should be independent of the Technical Institute and indeed the university. And so this basically led to stalemate, and for the next 25 years nothing happened because the Duncan trustees weren't willing to try and found their own art school, but neither were they willing to give the money to the Technical College because it didn't meet the criterion of Duncan's will. And it was only in 1933 that eventually an agreement was reached that the Technical College and School of Art was reformed as Dundee Institute of Art and Technology, with two separately organised colleges, Dundee Technical College and Dundee College of Art. The College of Art had its own committee running the college and a fair degree of autonomy, although still ultimately responsible to the governing body of the Institute of Art and Technology. And they also agreed that the money could only be spent on building a new art college building on a separate premises away from the Technical College on Bell Street. So they eventually found this site, the Belmont Estate. There was a grand 18th century house here, which they promptly demolished. And they had a big nationwide competition to design the building. They were all set to start. And then the Second World War intervened and the whole thing was mothballed. After the war, of course, priority was very much given to building new houses, so it was really difficult to get any kind of materials. there were post-war shortages, the value of the bequest had of course diminished, there were various disagreements between the Technical College Committee and the Art College Committee, and it was only finally in 1953 that they were able to start building a new Art College building on the site, what ultimately became the Crawford Building here on the right. The first students moved in 55, although they'd only actually completed the first 2 wings of the building at that point, and then the rest of the building followed over the next 7 or 8 years. Almost as soon as they'd moved everybody in, its success meant that it was immediately overcrowded, and eventually in 1974 they were then able to build a new building, the Matthew Building on the left, to expand. Architecturally, the 2 buildings couldn't be more different. The Matthew Building is a fairly extreme example of brutalist architecture, which definitely divides opinion. And it was only finally in 1975 that they completely split away from the Technical College, which, as I say, eventually became Abertay University. But they didn't have long to enjoy their independence. Less than 20 years, in fact, because in 1994 they merged with the University of Dundee and have been part of the university ever since. Okay, we're going to head up Hawkhill Place, this wee lane between the 2 Art College buildings. So the building that we're coming up to on the right here is Hawkhill House. This is actually the oldest building on the campus. It's an 18th century house. We're not exactly sure when it was built. It appears on the 1776 map of Dundee, so it's probably not very much older than that. Originally it was one large house. In the early 19th century, it was split into 2 separate apartments. These outside stairs were added to go into the upper part. The university bought the building in the 1960s, initially downstairs to house the botany department. The upstairs became the warden's house for Belmont Hall of Residence. But it's now home to the university museum collection, so this is where I'm based, and it's where we have our main stores and offices for museum services. Interestingly, the building is also the birthplace of James Alford Ewing, our first Professor of Engineering, who I told you about earlier. And the building is apparently haunted. There is apparently the ghost of a man who walks up and down the stairs. I have never seen him, but the last warden who lived in the house, he said that his children apparently used to sit and talk to this ghost. It was obviously quite a friendly ghost at that time, but they had met a family who lived in the house just after the Second World War, who had a young child, and apparently they had to leave after about 3 months because the child was so freaked out by the ghost. So, believe what you will. But he's been very quiet while I've been in there. Okay, we're just going to head back round the side of the building here. So we have the university tennis courts on the right here, and on the left are the Belmont Flats. Most of these have replaced an earlier development, Belmont Hall of Residence, which opened in 1963, of which only the main tower now survives, which was a fantastic example of kind of very Scandinavian-inspired modernist design. And the tower is kind of now slightly isolated. It doesn't really fit with the rest of the new buildings around it. The rather nice curved building here is the Queen Mother building, where computing are based. And here we are back at the Student Union, where we started. So, I hope you found that interesting. Do get in touch if you've got any questions, and do check out our website to find out more about the museum collections. Bye for now.